Hello again. So it's this person who forgets that they have YouTube, at least a place to put videos and stuff. I'll back up a little bit. Um, but I saw a video um, from Aztecross. This is Destiny 2 related. And he was talking about retcons. Myelin, another Destiny 2 YouTuber, he does more of the lore stuff, did a video on retcons and retcons being good or retcons being bad. And I played a lot of Destiny 2, played a lot of Destiny 1, and I had some thoughts that I wanted to throw into this. Um, so, what is a retcon? I think most people are familiar with retcons. If you're a big fan of film, specifically like franchise films, um, if you're a big fan of even, I imagine television shows do this too. But retconning it's a not an abbreviation, but it is in a way, I suppose. I can't think of what it would be called. I'm going to say it's an abbreviation for what's called retroactive continuity, right? So imagine you had a storyline, and later on you go back and revisit this film or comic book or television series or whatever it might be, video game, and you want to tell a new story, but your previous story is so absent flexibility because it's usually because it's very well written. You don't have a lot of wiggle room. You don't have a lot of threads left that you can sort of pull on to create a new story. So what you do is in the pursuit of telling a new story, you go back and you rewrite part of an old story. Ideally, one of the easiest ways to do that is to rewrite a small piece of a story. Right? You don't want to rewrite the whole thing. You want to take just a small piece of it and rewrite that to then give yourself an out to be able to then tell something new. You see this happens again in film. This happens in it's pretty common in video games because especially like franchises. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but you can think of like I imagine Halo has retcons in it somewhere. In fact, I'm almost sure that they do with the Forerunner stuff because, Bungie, they create great lore, but there's no way they had an idea of how far back all of this was going to go. So you can imagine then when they started telling the story about Forerunners, then they tell more of the story, then they realize they want to tell something else, but they can't do that because it clashes with this, so then you have to go back and you have to change something in order to, progress and be able to get to a story you want to tell. So then the question comes up, are retcons good or bad? And I would say that retcons just are. It really depends on what you do with them, right? So if you retcon a specific event in a video game, in a movie, that can give you enough wiggle room to be able to tell a new story, right? And one of the easiest ways to do that is with character perspective. So you can have, say, the first film in a trilogy or whatever, however many films it ends up being, where you see a series of events from one character and that tells one story. And maybe you never planned on telling another story, but it becomes popular and you decide you want to franchise this bitch because there's money to be made. And maybe a good story is to be told too. So then what you can do for the second one is you can actually take a new character that wasn't in the first one, or was in the first one, but maybe it was just sort of glossed over. And you can take the exact same set of events from the first film, and you can show them from a different character's perspective, and then that gives you an opportunity to show that what we originally saw as being a nice tight bow tied around the events of the story actually wasn't. There were things that happened that from our side we didn't see, and someone else did. A good example of this would be with, and I don't know if that's technically a retcon, but the idea that I'm going for with that would be like Halo 3 and then Halo 3 ODST, right? In Halo 3, you fight in New Mombasa in Africa. The Covenant activate the Dreadnought, and they zip away from Earth. They disappear. They go through slip space to get to the Ark, right? And humanity follows them. So you're fighting on the ground in New Mombasa. You get on board the UNSC ships that are there, and then that particular battle group takes off after the Covenant. So from Halo 3's perspective, from Master Chief's perspective, the fight in New Mombasa is over the moment you go through slipspace and you arrive at the Ark. But then Bungie decides that they want to keep telling that story. So then they switch us to an ODST who lands in New Mombasa after we've left. And then what you find out is that, well, actually, in the events of Halo 3, that fight didn't end when it ended for us in the game. It actually kept going. And here's another character, so we can show more of the story, right? Maybe not technically a retcon, but that's the kind of thing that you could do as a retcon that would be more acceptable to consumers, because you're not outright taking established lore and story and then just gutting it because you can, because you've written yourself into a dead end, and now you have to go back and destroy everything established to write yourself out of that dead end. So that would be a retcon that could work. You take one event and you switch perspective, and now you've got some latitude. Now you can tell different stories without having gone back and changed the value or importance of what previously occurred in the previous story. And then you have the other end. And then you have retcons that are just awful, terrible. And then, well, okay, we'll stick with that for a second. So I'm going to jump on a soapbox here for a minute. I don't particularly care for Terminator as a franchise. I think Terminator 1, I don't really even like Terminator 1 that much, but I appreciate the value that it has to cinema. James Cameron and Terminator 1 are 10 out of 10. It's a 10 out of 10 film. It's a masterclass in filmmaking. It's a masterclass in just about every category in filmmaking. So even if you don't like the film, you can at least appreciate the value that it has and the cultural impact that it had. And the level of representation for that craft that is present in that film. I would say the same thing is true with Alien. You might not like Alien because it is a bit of a slower film, and it's not so much a horror film as it's more like a space thriller with some horror elements mixed into it. Even if you don't like Alien, though, you have to appreciate it's a mastercraft film in directing, in lighting, in cinematography, in acting, in the way that it's able to carry consistent themes all the way through. I would say that the first Terminator is like that. The second Terminator I've seen like twice, and I mean, it's fun, it's okay. And then after that, I really don't give a damn save Terminator Salvation. I actually really like Terminator Salvation. But the reason I bring Terminator up is because if you look at what they've done to that franchise consistently over the years, they have taken Terminator and they have made it an absolute laughingstock in film for years, because they can't tell a consistent story. And the biggest problem with that is the use of retcons and the use of time travel. And some genius somewhere thought, you know what would really make a banging story and just take this particular IP and just send it to the moon, is if we took two of these really, really interesting MacGuffins and just put them together. So you have Terminator 1 storyline, right? Or you have the Terminator storyline initially, which is you have one robot sent back by an army of robots after they've won a war from the future to the past to prevent humanity from having a leader that beats them in the future. So you're already sort of confused. But you're like, okay, I'm willing to bite. And then as it gets further and further down the line, they start doing retcons and they start doing more time travel. They start, like Terminator Genesis is a fantastic example of a retcon that could have been great and just wasn't. I think the biggest reason that Terminator Genesis sort of fell on its face was because the franchise at that point had been a laughingstock for so long. Nobody really gave a shit. No one really cared. They were past the point of caring. Terminator, and it's damaging because you're never going to get that franchise back to what it could have been. It's been so irreparably damaged by just absolute poor writing and the use of retcons and time travel as a way to get themselves out of terrible situations that they put themselves in, that you're never going to be able to push it to a point where it can be redeemed. Because everyone who, if you made a good Terminator film now in the modern era, that would be a breath of fresh air. But people would couch their excitement for it, waiting for whenever the events of that story just get completely retconned, and then it never happened. And now they're going to tell a different story. That is a consistent thing that happens in Terminator, and it's why the Terminator franchise is so bad. So, long-winded explanation for retcons right now, as it pertains to Destiny 2, because that was what this was about. I can't think of any specific, really egregious retcons that were done in Destiny 2. The one that's brought up by Myelin in his video, again, Myelin Games is the YouTube channel, and he does Destiny lore stuff is what he does. He brings up how in Destiny there are these things called war mines, which are essentially like the AIs from Halo. Halo and Destiny, when you put them together, there's a lot of stuff that really overlaps there. But it's great because it's all stuff Bungie can excel telling stories with, so I don't have a problem with that. But in Destiny, there were these things called war mines. And you find out about them in Destiny 1. I believe there's even a moment in the Destiny 1 campaign when you interact with Rasputin, you hear a message from Rasputin, and then the ghost elaborates that that's a war mine and then tells you briefly what they were. But essentially, war mines are supercomputers. They're artificial intelligence based supercomputers that are responsible for coordination of military and civilian assets to protect humanity. Right? It's essentially Skynet without Skynet having turned on humanity. Although that did kind of happen in Destiny, but that's a tangent. So that was the thing, right? There was lore about, there was war mines in Destiny, and there was lore about how there were different war mines. It was either every planet had one, or they divided up human-occupied space into certain sections, and every section had a war mine, and then all of the war mines would coordinate with each other because preservation of humanity was their chief objective. So if one faced a threat, then the other ones could help coordinate assets and resources to help push that threat away, etc., etc. And then Destiny 2 releases an expansion called Warmind. And in that expansion, it's revealed that no, actually there's only one Warmind. And the others that are mentioned are submines. So, there's trying to think of what it is in Halo. Again, another Halo comparison. In Halo, most people are familiar that the Flood has a grave mind. There's actually, I believe, there's actually a higher form of grave mind we've never seen in the games, but it's in the Halo Encyclopedia. And the Flood does the same thing, where the grave mind is the one who's in charge of all of the Flood, right? But it gets to a point where there are so many of them that it'll actually create smaller versions of itself. I can't remember what they're called. Might be called hive minds, actually. And the hive minds are responsible for specific tasks so that the grave mind isn't constantly having to manage all of the Flood at one time. So that's a concept that took into Destiny. Well, no, originally we thought there were a bunch of war minds. No, actually what it is there's one war mind that sits at the top, and then it has other sub-minds so that it doesn't have to, by itself, figure everything out, work doing everything. It can assign tasks to these specific other minds, and that allows the overarching mind to focus on whatever the most pressing problem is. And Myelin says that that's a retcon. He also mentions perspective, that it's one of the defenses that Bungie gave to why this happens is because perspective, I mean, you're talking about stories from a universe, so you're going to have characters who are going to hear things that then become stories, sort of like playing telephone. And so they hear something and they tell that story, and then when the story finally makes it to a lore book, because it's been telephoned, what you're told is not actually what is true. It's just what that person believes or what they were told. And how they play with perspective in the lore as a way of being able to sort of justify some of the changes that they make, in that you're being told a story by somebody that may not be true because of who they heard it from or because of how long the story took before it got to them. And Myelin mentions that's a bad retcon. I don't think so. I would disagree with that. I don't think that's a bad retcon, um, at all. I think perspective in that case makes sense. There is value. I mentioned it earlier in the video. There is value in being able to take a perspective from a character or a perspective of a storyline that you haven't seen before, and create a new story parallel to that one with a new character who then does different things, but it's based off that original thing. You haven't changed the storyline that originally happened. All you've done is add finer details to it. Again, think about Halo 3 and Halo 3 ODST. In Halo 3, the fight with New Mombasa ends when Master Chief leaves. Halo 3 steps in, or ODST steps in, and it doesn't retell that story. All it does is it takes that specific moment in Halo 3, the fight in New Mombasa, and then it switches the perspective, and because they do that, they then can tell a brand new story with a brand new set of characters set in this one moment in this one original story that you have not changed. I would contend that the Warmind change in Destiny is the same thing. You're not rewriting anything. You're simply addressing the fact that perspective played a part. We had a perspective that we believed because that's the stories that we were told, but they weren't accurate. I don't think that's a bad retcon. I can't think of a bad retcon that Destiny has had. One of the other things that Myelin mentioned is that, and Cross mentioned this too, Aztecross mentioned it, is that you run into this problem, though, where if you start saying that perspective is the reason why what the lore says originally and then what it says afterwards is so different, if your argument for that is because perspective, God, I just cannot hold this thing. Both of them said that becomes a problem because then you start to question, how can you ever know what's true? In Destiny 2, there are a lot of lore books and a lot of lore entries. And there are people who make their living covering the lore in the game because it is massive. I mean, they're doing a Destiny TV show. Excuse me. And if they do that right, that show could go for years. There's so much shit in that game they could tell stories on in a TV show. But that's a valid point, though. Somewhere you have to draw a line. Somewhere you have to be willing to put a flag down and say that we are not going to retcon this in any way, nor are we going to give this the perspective treatment and then do something different with it. You have to have points where you can definitively put a flag down. This is concrete and cannot change. Where is that point? I don't know. For Destiny, I mean, in their defense, Bungie has put things out where they have included that this book may be, I think it's Truth and Power. One of the things that's said in that book is that this book might be full of lies. Or I think it says this book is full of lies. So it's like, it's not like it's not as if Bungie is giving us what they're claiming is gospel, and then they just sort of pull the rug out from underneath of you really quickly and laugh in your face when you fall on your ass because, haha, you thought that was true. No, that's not what they're doing. They have definitively given us moments in the game, Truth to Power, unveiling. They have told us that if it comes from the darkness, the witness, then it's not reliable. It's not a reliable source, and you need to keep that in mind. So they do let us know that perspective is important, and perspective does play a part in here. But I do think that is a just criticism to an extent. You do have to have concrete things that you can't change. Otherwise, if everything in your game, final thought here is, if everything in your game, your universe, for a video game, for a TV series, for a comic, for a series of books, if everything in that is the underpinning for the lore that builds the stories you want to tell, if at every single turn your answer for why things consistently are changing is because my perspective changes, which it does have some value and you can use safely and you can use smart to tell new stories. But if that's what you say everything that underlies the foundation of your universe is, at some point it disillusions fans because there's no reason to get invested in anything if at any moment the parts that you're invested in end up becoming lies, are revealed to be lies or half truths or inaccurate. So then people start to not want to get invested because they don't know when you're going to pull the rug out from underneath of them, and then they're going to see that this was all just not accurate. So as far as retcons and Destiny 2, I don't think Destiny 2 has done any bad retcons yet. I think it is possible for them to do that, but I don't think they've done it yet. I think there's value and perspective change. We'll see what they do with Final Shape. The showcase is coming up. I'm curious to see what they're going to do with this, but I don't know. I saw that video and I figured I would chime in with my worthless 2 cents, but there it is. Adios.